Well, welcome. I'm pleased to be here again at Adobe DITAWORLD. And I'm here today to give a retrospective about where DITA has been and where it's going. So in many ways, the questions really for this presentation are designed to be the starting points for a conversation. And DITA is 15 years old now. It's no longer a shiny new thing, but it's a robust, well-established architecture that has spawned a DITA universe, if you will, of tools and consultants and users and products, many of whom you've heard about over the past 3 days of the conference. So as a retrospective, some of the questions for the conversation are really, what was DITA designed for and how well has it met its original objective? Have new problems emerged since DITA was first developed at IBM and then donated to OASIS? How is the landscape of the technical communications field, or seriously just product communications, different in 2020 than it was at the turn of the century or in 2005? And perhaps do people have new expectations for DITA? Comment here, all the graphics in this presentation are open source, and I tend to have grabbed them from various British museums. So sometimes they're not exactly the image that I really would have liked to have chosen. So here's where I think we need to go back to DITA's origin story. And I'm going to intersperse some tidbits about my own personal background as I go along here. For example, I was at IBM between 2001 and 2009. I wore all sorts of different hats: contractor, IBM regular, writer, tool specialist, information architect, vendor. So that's the context out of which I'm speaking. I was not involved in the early development of DITA, however. I came to DITA as an end user when I started using DITA in 2002. So if we look back to the origin story, I'm sure most of you know that DITA grew out of a project at IBM. There was a work group coming out of user technologies that was commissioned in 1998, 1999 to try to look ahead to the needs of IBM's information development and to look at their needs of the community of IBM information developers. DITA was first made available outside of IBM in 2001, and this happened through DeveloperWorks. It was an article explaining DITA, the new architecture, and associated downloads. And by associated downloads, I mean early grammar files, DTDs, and some scripts that eventually became the DITA Open Toolkit, which is an open source project. And I think the critical thing to remember is from the very onset, DITA was intended to be an architecture, and an architecture that would support authoring, producing, and delivering technical information in a wide variety of fields, in a wide variety of ways. And this is where I normally like to stop and interject and talk a little bit about what DITA is and what it isn't. As I mentioned, it's an architecture, it's a standard, it's now governed by OASIS and has been since 2005. What it isn't, it's not a tool or an application. And when I say a tool or an application, I might be thinking of an authoring tool like FrameMaker or Oxygen XML Editor, or a CCMS like Ixiasoft or the STL product or Adobe Experience Manager. And those are all applications that bundle DITA, the DTDs. And they often also bundle the DITA Open Toolkit, which is another application. And DITA and the DITA Open Toolkit and DITA and the many applications that are layered on top of DITA that use DITA are two separate things. And let me just step back, and I can understand that there's obviously always been some confusion around this point. I mean, when IBM first released DITA to the world, it was bundled together with what became the DITA Open Toolkit. And many of the people that work on the DITA standard at OASIS are also involved in open source projects like the DITA Open Toolkit. So people can make some confusions, but they really are. DITA is separate from the many applications and CCMS and solutions that use it and various tools. So to really make sense of where DITA came from, of its origin story, we need to look at what technical communication and information development was like at IBM at the turn of the century. And the first thing to know is in the late 90s, what IBM information developers used was a IBM custom SGML variant. It was called IBM ID Doc, and it was a book-oriented XML structure. It was very, very large, very, very unwieldy, very custom. And in part because of that, it meant that at that point in time, IBM was really locked into a very expensive tool stack. And they used Arbor Text Editor, which was very highly customized to work with IBM ID Doc. Again, a proprietary SGML language. They used OmniMark for processing, and they used XML Professional Publisher. Some of you also might be more familiar with it as Zyvision to produce their PDFs. And it's an expensive proposition. They'd customized all these tools to the extent that they were very much locked into them. And there, of course, there weren't other companies out there that were using IBM ID Doc. And part of what that meant was, for example, if you were a new hire at IBM, there was quite a long ramp-up time as you learned SGML, as you learned the details of the IBM ID Doc architecture, as you learned how to author content in a customized editor and store it, and then publish it using a pretty customized process. And in fact, what that really led to was there was really an entire niche industry grew up that no longer quite exists, but certainly through the first decade of the 21st century and earlier was really just simply provided contractors to IBM who were skilled in IBM ID Doc and the necessary IBM toolset. Other things to know about the landscape at IBM at the time will sound familiar nowadays, but was less common 20 years ago. At that point, IBM was kind of ahead of the curve in terms of the maturity of their information development and what they were trying to accomplish. So they did do fairly extensive multi-channel publishing, print, PDF, web, online help. Their content was localized extensively. And interestingly enough, also their products were beginning to merge into solutions with IBM, within IBM. So there was more of a need to try to bundle content from different IBM products in a usable way to consumers. It was also becoming increasingly difficult to bring in content from IBM's many business partners and acquisitions due to needing to get people on board with IBM ID Doc with a very specialized publishing set of tools. And of course, acquisitions were increasing at that point in time. So if you look at this landscape at IBM, there are just some fairly basic business requirements that IBM was business requirements and business problems that IBM was looking to solve with DITA. And I'm sure many of these are going to sound familiar to people when they think about perhaps their own migration to DITA and their business requirements and reasons for doing it. Because I think many of these are common. I mean, IBM really needed to support its investment in a large corpus of legacy documents in a wide variety of formats, both directly from IBM, things coming in from acquisitions like Lotus Notes, and they also needed to really provide an infrastructure that would support the then very new Eclipse-based information centers. And there were some very specific problems that IBM was quite conscious of and wanting to solve as they moved forward with new solutions for information development. They wanted to try to break the lock-in to the expensive proprietary tool chain. They wanted to try to scale back how long it took to ramp up information developers to come on board, cut back on, reduce the expenses of translation. All of these things probably sound familiar. So again, I think those are some of the very concrete, practical realities that were around and driving the development of DITA. On a more future, idealistic perspective, there were also some very clear goals for DITA to really support topic orientation, to try to take advantage of what everyone had been promised with XML: reuse, semantics, specificity, interchangeability, and actually see it happen. And of course, the third bullet point here, is one that I think people wanted in 20 years ago, and we are still working on. How do we do the best job of really delivering content in a smart way that lets end users search in a way that will yield good results and that will get the right information to them at the right time? So I think we need to think of both of these, future thinking of the direction of information development and the business realities at IBM as drivers for the development and the emergence of DITA. So if we step back again to the history, as I mentioned earlier, it was first made available to the world in 2001 and then donated in 2004 to OASIS, which stands for the Organization for the Advancement of Structured Information Standard. It's also the standards body out of which DocBook and XLIF are developed. Those are probably the other standards that I think folks listening to this session might have heard about. So donated in 2004, and the DITA Technical Committee was established. At the time that IBM was donating DITA to OASIS, OASIS did not want the code that later became the DITA Open Toolkit project. So that was set up as a separate open source project. And simply the grammar files, the DDD, the architecture went to OASIS. DITA was first approved as a standard in June 2005, and then there were subsequent releases in 2007, 2010, 2016. My involvement with the DITA Technical Committee stems back to, I think, 2008, when I joined OASIS as an individual member because I wanted to be involved with the dita.xml.org website. And then I got more involved, became secretary, co-chair, and I have been chair of the technical committee for, I think, the past 6 years. So if we're kind of sticking in this realm of origin story and early history, outside of IBM, early adopters did very well with getting up and running with and just mentioning a handful of companies here: Nokia, AMD, Ixiasoft, Idiom, and I'm sure Adobe was also one of very early adopters. And let's shift forward in time 15 years and look at how things are different now than they were in 2005. Originally, DITA was primarily put in use for technical information, for technical documentation, and largely in software and hardware industries. And DITA is now used for much, much more than software and hardware. I know that Keith Shengley-Roberts from Precision Content gave a presentation earlier in the conference, and I'm sure he covered the growth of the number of companies that use DITA and the wide varieties of industry sectors in which DITA is used. I think some of the companies that, or the industry sectors that I'm most familiar with are in the medical information, medical device, pharmaceutical information space. The other two bullet points, I think, really hit on something that is very different in 2020 than 2005. Web-delivered content rules. It's the queen or the king, the reigning monarch. And we really have seen a accompanying decline of the book paradigm and the rise of DITA, the rise of topic orientation. In many ways, I think DITA really emerged and rode the wave of an interest in topic orientation and providing more modular, granular content to end users. And that's a nice segue to, I think, some of the new use cases for DITA that are certainly currently very relevant, but might not have been considered 15 years ago. And that's, for example, micro-content for chatbots, for artificial intelligence-driven applications, using very semantically rich content for things like medical records. And I'm sure folks can also think of other use cases, and I'd love to hear about them. Again, remember, these are starting points for a conversation. Where DITA came from, where it's been, where it is now, and how well it's met its original goals. Another thing that I think is incredibly different in 2020 than at the turn of the century or in 2005 is the wide variety of tools that exist to support DITA, DITA authoring, DITA publishing, DITA content storage, translation, just a wide variety of vendors that develop tools that support DITA, the DITA ecosystem, and that let companies choose whatever product best meets their business requirements, their goals. We also have a very large set of free and open source offerings that many DITA users are using for their DITA infrastructure. The DITA Open Toolkit, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. And I think many small companies often use these offerings or use them perhaps for initial proofs of concept before embarking on their search for selecting a DITA CCMS, like Adobe Experience Manager with the XML documentation plugin. In comparison to 15, 20 years ago, are also many, many more services that are subscription-based and that are offered in the cloud. And this is storage, for conversion, for localization, I think for anything in all of the different sectors of the applications that support authoring, storing, publishing, translating, reviewing data. And an important point, these tools, compared to the price points of 2 decades ago, are inexpensive. If we shift to looking a little bit about authoring resources, things look a little different now than they do 20 years ago. I think we certainly in some industries have fewer technical writers, and that's balanced by the increase in documentation that's written by subject matter experts, often using Markdown, or documentation that is automatically generated from code. The other thing is the rich growth of tooling around data has enabled there are quite a number of very excellent authoring tools that really hide the XML from the authors and make it very easy for a subject matter expert to author some content in data without ever really realizing that it is data on the back end. And another thing, and if we're going back to looking at some of the IBM problems IBM was hoping to solve, in 2020, I think there's a fairly large established community of technical writers with data expertise. It's not just a little, niche skill. It is very commonly requested in most job postings for technical writers. Big contrast to the old days of IBM IDDoc. So if we look at the landscape for adoption now, and I think Keith Shangley Roberts again probably will have covered this well, is there's been a fairly quiet but thorough adoption by large companies, especially companies for whom information is a revenue-generating product. I think the place where we still see and we hear about pain for data adoption is for very small implementations in small companies where documentation is a cost center and they perhaps do not have the fiscal resources for everything that they really need. But another thing is interesting now in comparison to 15, 20 years ago is we also have non-XML products like Author IT, like Poligo, like Flare that are offering support for topic orientation. So this is a good point to kind of stop and ask, has DITA delivered on some of the things that it originally promised? And I think it really has. If there are those of you that think differently, it's a great point to bring up in the questions or offline with me. I'd love to hear about it. But if we look at some of the things that were originally laid out as core criteria for the data architecture, support for topic orientation, reuse by reference, ease of being able to interchange between different companies, between different applications, having a larger environment of tools to support information development and publishing and storage and content delivery, more authors with requisite skills for topic-based authoring and working with XML and with data, and also the ability to meet future needs. It's always hard to future-proof something, but I think the data architecture has held up well, and certainly with its specialization mechanism and simply the soundness of the underlying architecture, it's been able to meet the needs for micro-content and semantically rich structure for consumption by artificial intelligence very well. That's not to say that there aren't some pain points. And as someone very active with the DITA Technical Committee and also the DITA Open Toolkit, I often will hear about pain points that people are experiencing with DITA more than I hear about things that are good, things that are useful, things that are successful. And there still are, I think, companies that may have well-established DITA implementations that are several years old that still experience some frustration, some sense of complexity of DITA, and a feeling that they're maybe not getting the full benefits of reuse. From literally the perspective of the DITA Technical Committee and the DITA Open Toolkit project, we have much less corporate support than we did 15 years ago. And that's difficult. That means the DITA Technical Committee is 100% run on volunteer labor. We depend on companies that sponsor their employees to work on the DITA committee and perhaps to allocate some of their time to work on the architecture. Same for the DITA Open Toolkit. And when that doesn't happen, that's difficult. That means that the future of DITA, the DITA Open Toolkit, the standard and some of the open source projects around it fall on the shoulders of too few of you. I think other things that we've certainly seen is we've seen increased expectations for DITA. And this sometimes really falls into the area of where it's important for people to be making distinctions between DITA, the architecture, or the applications that use DITA and provide a solution to a company. More and more, I think we as people new to DITA come to DITA, they're kind of expecting it almost to be a shrink-wrapped product. And quote here I really love came from a fairly new member of the DITA Technical Committee, Zoe Lawson. She works for CaseNet. And her comment was, people want a really fancy Thanksgiving dinner, but they want to make it out of their microwave ovens. And there's some things that are just not compatible. You want a fancy Thanksgiving dinner, you need a good chef, you need very good ingredients, you need more than a microwave oven. You need a good component content storage, component content management system like Adobe Experience Manager that helps storage your content, helps your author content, and helps you deliver content where you need to deliver it in many different formats. And this is where I often come to what I call the DITA reality check. And I think this is most applicable to people who are trying to do DITA on a shoestring in a very small implementation. And DITA is XML. There's inherent complexity to XML. If you're lucky, you're working your company has an infrastructure and an ecosystem that really hides a lot of that complexity from you and simply lets you spend your time doing what you want to do, which is develop content and develop it effectively. But I do remind people who are trying to do DITA on a shoestring that you're going to need XML and XSLT skills. So build those skills in-house or plan on retaining a consultant for support. And most companies, even if they're in the software space, often do not have a lot of XML or XSLT skills. The other thing I think is inevitable and crops up when we talk about, certainly crops up when I talk to companies who are saying, hey, we've been in DITA, we have all this DITA content, but we don't think we are really getting the reuse. And the benefits of reuse are completely dependent on having a solid, thoughtful information architecture, which in turn has to be based on an analysis of business processes and requirements. This is work, it's not free. There's no magic button, there's no free lunch. Garbage in, if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. And I think this is true regardless of how snazzy your tooling environment or infrastructure may be. At the heart of having good technical information, you need to have good information architecture. So where is DITA going? Stefan made a special request that I not just do a retrospective of DITA, but also talk about where DITA is going and moving forward. That was often something that people were looking forward to hear in the last presentation of this conference from myself or Robert Anderson. And we've got a number of things that are on our plate. We're hoping that DITA 2.0 will be released maybe a year from now. That might be a little overly optimistic. It perhaps is likely that it will fall into 2022. I think certainly for the technical committee, like many people, the pandemic really has set us back time-wise, especially since we are volunteer labor and all of us have been dealing with other things in addition to our lives and our work, perhaps schooling children, unemployment, all sorts of different things. Other things that we have and have had on the drawing board for several years, and perhaps you're more familiar with what it contains, are lightweight DITA. I'm not going to try to guess when we're going to release lightweight DITA, but it will be after DITA 2.0, since DITA 2.0 is the necessary base for lightweight DITA. Other things that I know we have on the wish list is we'd love to see more adoption resources. And of course, greater corporate participation in the DITA Technical Committee. So here is my perennial plea. Find out if your company is an OASIS member. And if your company is an OASIS member, think about whether you or somebody representing your company's interests in DITA could be involved with the DITA Technical Committee. If your company is not a member of OASIS, perhaps the company should join. There are a variety of possibilities that can be less or more expensive or more cost effective. And I just feel free, everybody should feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about participation in OASIS, what it costs, how it works, and so forth. I want to spend a bit more time talking about the contours of DITA 2.0. The first thing, and perhaps you know this already, because I think we've been bringing this up for at least the last 5-6 years, is DITA 2.0 is going to be our first backwards incompatible release. And this is something that when we first mention it often is a bit unnerving to people. You will still be able to have DITA 1.3 or DITA 1.2 or 1.1 content and publish it. But if you're interested in using the DITA 2.0 grammar files and architecture, it is not backwards incompatible. And this has been an important thing for us. I mean, over the 15 years of DITA releases, we've built up a certain amount of technical debt. We've made mistakes, some of them very minor in things that, an extraneous attribute value that made its way into DTDs, but not XSDs or RNG. And we've made some design choices that are less than optimal. And moving to DITA 2.0 and is letting us kind of jettison the very heavy weight of ensuring that our DITA releases have been backwards compatible. We don't have to do that. We can fix things. We can get rid of, jettison some of our debt and correct earlier choices. For example, one of the things we realized shortly after releasing DITA 1.3 was that the troubleshooting topic was missing a very important section. It did not have a section for diagnostic information that would provide the necessary information that would enable authors to communicate information that would help users determine what's the problem? What is my potential solution? How do I diagnose what I do next? And because DITA 1.3 was all delivered, we delivered the base and technical content and learning and training all bundled together, we could not remedy that problem with a technical communication package until DITA 2.0. So one of the things you'll see is different with DITA 2.0 is we will be delivering things in an iterative manner. The DITA 2.0 base, and by base I mean the core architecture, topic, DITA map, subject scheme, conref, conkeyref, keys, these very essential aspects of DITA, that base will be published as a standard first. And hopefully, not that long after, we'll deliver another technical communication package with updates to concept, task, reference, bookmap, glossary. And we do know that for many people, certainly if you're developing technical information or doing technical writing, you're often using that technical communication package. So some highlights of DITA 2.0. And this is not a complete list. I just tried to lay out a few things that I thought people might be most interested in. If people are more interested in getting a more detailed list, just ping me and I will help you out with that. But we have native support for multimedia, for audio and video, in a way that maps very well to HTML5. That should make working with multimedia content much easier for authors. We have simplified chunking. And some of you are going to be asking, chunking? What's chunking? And probably not something that everybody is a bit familiar with, but it's an attribute that you can use in your DITA maps to instruct a processor and tell a processor, hey, here's my DITA topic. I want this to be split into multiple output files. Or here are my multiple DITA topics. I just want one output file. And in 1.3, we had a very confusing array of values for chunking. And for DITA 2.0, they really become very simple. Do you want to split your content into multiple output files, or do you want to merge them into one? We have the new diagnostic element for the troubleshooting topic that I mentioned, and also a new hardware domain. This is actually just a two-element domain, but many people have said, hey, we really need a way to semantically identify a control on a hardware unit and make it clear that this is not a user interface control on a screen. And people have said we're jumping through all sorts of silly hoops with output classes and tortured processing to get around styling these things differently. So that will be there in DITA 2.0. The other thing, of course, is We have, for DITA 2.0, we're removing everything that had been deprecated in previous releases. People ask, what are examples of things that have been deprecated? And I think the things that are going to be most common that will probably affect existing content most drastically, we will not have a alt attribute for images in DITA 2.0. There will not be a nav title attribute on topic ref or topic ref specializations. Both those elements were replaced, both those attributes were replaced several releases ago with elements, the alt element and the nav title element, to better facilitate translation. We're removing the print attribute, which was really deprecated with the introduction of the delivery target attribute in DITA 1.3. For practitioners, and by practitioners I mean people here that are coding the content models for implementations and building document type shells, EDDs or RNG, constraint modules, specializations. We're introducing a more finer grained ability to control where a particular attribute specialization is applied. So that you no longer, if you're introducing new attributes, they don't have to be universally available. And the last bullet point here on the slide deck is something that I think a lot of folks authoring content will find helpful. Is we're making changes to the task topic to remove sub-steps. And instead, you'll have the ability to nest steps. Originally, sub-steps was defined to make it impossible for authors to nest steps too deeply. That was very much a response to IBM's specific content model for task-based information. But it's become very clear to us that that really is an impediment to reuse. And certainly if you're authoring task-based information, there are times when you might want to be able to reuse steps as sub-steps or sub-steps as steps, and you can't do that. And so by allowing steps to nest, that reuse problem is solved. And there are other ways, if you want to restrict the ability of your authors to nest steps indefinitely, there are other ways to address that problem using schematron or other mechanisms. Just a quick nod here to lightweight DITA. Again, not a new idea. It's the idea that how do we make DITA slim down and more accessible? And by slimming it down, we pretty much identified a core subset of DITA elements, attributes, and functionality. And we'll be releasing this in 3 separate co-equal authoring formats. Folks who want to author in XML can author in XDITA. Software engineers who want to contribute Markdown can author directly in Markdown or a Markdown-based version of lightweight DITA, MDITA. Or marketing authors who are very well familiar and versed in HTML can author in HDITA or HTML DITA. And again, for the first release of lightweight DITA, what will be available is simply a topic and a map. And kind of a necessary comment, I think lightweight DITA gives us another tool in our toolbox. You already have a DITA implementation, not something you're going to want to necessarily migrate your content to, but it might be in addition to your content model to let some other authoring groups participate who perhaps are not interested in authoring in XML. And I think I'm at the top of my length of time. So I probably will go ahead and stop sharing here and let's open up the floor to questions. Questions, comments, reactions, thoughts for this conversation of where DITA has been and where it's going.
Great job, Kristen.
Thank you.
Do
we have comments or questions that have popped up in the Q&A queue?
I think we do, and we had some great ones. First, Laura was asking an important one. How can somebody as an individual participate in OASIS? And I think you are going to have the answer to that question.
Absolutely. If you own your own intellectual property, you can participate in OASIS as an individual member. The fee for doing so is around $300 a year. If you work for a company and your company owns your intellectual property, there is also the option for a company to buy what's called an associate membership that will let a company designate a single individual to participate on behalf of that company in the OASIS technical committees. And the cost for that is around $1,200 a year, which is certainly if you're comparing that to the cost to be a full-blown corporate OASIS member, it looks pretty good price point.
Non-trivial, but still a good deal.
Yeah. Again, not for an individual person. That's why there's a separate individual member category, and then the category for people to represent their company as a single individual.
Yeah. You know, I think the best question, and I'm not sucking up just because I know her as a client, but Sue Thompson asked, apart from the pain points, which seem to be due to perception, are there things which you had hoped for, but for which DITA has failed to deliver as yet?
Oh, it's a great question. I think that, the main disappointment for me is the fact that there is not more active participations of companies that have made large investments in DITA. Mm-hmm. That there aren't as many companies involved in the development of the standard or the development of open source tools. That's the one thing. I mean, I think IBM certainly made a very definite strategic move in donating DITA to OASIS. They wanted to make it generally available. They wanted to spread the cost of DITA development around different companies. They wanted to encourage the growth of writers with DITA skills. But we have not really seen the participation from companies as much as we would like.
Yeah.
And some of that is, I know it's hard. It is there can be a significant ramp up time to be a really high contributing member of the DITA Technical Committee. Mm-hmm. But if your company, if your strategy is built around DITA, if your products are built around DITA, think about making an investment in the direction of where the standard goes.
Yeah, it's good to make a pitch. Make a pitch to your organization that this is part of your job responsibility and perhaps part of your quote unquote 40 hours a week, as opposed to extracurricular that you're going to be doing in the evenings and on the weekends.
Exactly.
Yeah. As with everything.
Otherwise, of course, I'm well situated to, if there are things I think the standard lacks, I'm well situated to suggest it.
Yeah.
And we have a very good core community of people on the DITA Technical Committee. Most of us have worked together for many, many years, and we vet what goes into a new version of DITA pretty rigorously. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the things we're also doing in DITA 2.0 is we're doing some culling out You know, there are perhaps some features or aspects of DITA that we introduced unwisely in DITA 1.2 that are that actually are duplicate features or elements. We're removing those.
Well, Darwin is in there for a reason, right?
It is. It's very much an evolving process.
Yeah. David DiMartino is asking, is there anything that you see as coming up as a rival or a potential replacement for DITA? Other than Markdown, I suppose, which doesn't really, it fits a different market. But
yeah, I have not. I am not aware of another XML-based architecture that is designed to produce modular content with a rich possibility for semantic and metadata enrichment.
Well, I figured it took us
I think Markdown is great. But I think of Markdown not as a replacement, but as something that can augment and accentuate and add to what we have in our DITA toolbox.
Well,
I think it's marvelous if we get software engineers that are authoring content in Markdown that we can then pull into a larger DITA publishing chain.
Yeah, 25 years to get this far. I don't think it's a bit of a head start on the next global standard. All right, Stefan, how are we doing?
Doing good. Have we answered all questions?
There was a few folks were asking about lightweight DITA versus DITA with constraints or full DITA. And I made the observation to June, I think, that lightweight DITA is, while it's available right now, it might not be fully signed off and released as far as OASIS and the committee is concerned. But do you see lightweight DITA as being its own solution, or what I had mentioned was that it might be better positioned as an entry into valid DITA because of its, the narrow amount of things that you can describe with that model?
I think it could be both. I think there's certainly some environments in which lightweight DITA will meet the full business requirements of a company.
Okay.
And if it meets requirements, why go with something larger? Yeah. We do try to make it, very clear. Here's what's in lightweight DITA. Here's what's not. Here are the things you can do in lightweight DITA. Here it does not cover these things that are in full DITA. Yep. But I think if somebody implements lightweight DITA and find that it doesn't meet all of their needs, it will be a very simple move to the full DITA, since it will be a subset.
And I think Kirk was making the point that the analogy wasn't quite correct with Photoshop Elements versus Photoshop, where Photoshop Elements is its own workflow, its own format, its own tools and conventions, where in comparison, lightweight DITA is DITA. It's just a very small subset of DITA. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Yeah.
And I will just honestly say for many companies, certainly for smaller implementations, lightweight DITA will meet the needs.
Yep.
For example, in my own consulting practice, when I author contracts, agreements, materials that I use with clients, almost all of that is authored in a combination of Markdown and lightweight DITA.
Oh, excellent.
It's just simply from the point of view that I need a topic, I need a map, I need paragraphs, I need lists, tables, and images.
Yep.
And those are all in lightweight DITA.
And
The
there
one
you
thing
go.
I didn't mention about DITA 2.0 that people might be happy to hear about, and this is a change driven by the need for the requirements of lightweight DITA. In DITA 2.0, you'll have the ability to specify titles on simple tables and do some simple column and row spanning, so that the DITA 2.0 simple table element will have very much the functionality of a standard HTML table.
Excellent. Okay, Stefan, you want to hop in and we good on the recording? Got anything you'd like to add to wrap? Stefan may have German internet issues right now.
Well, I will just add, once again, it's a big pleasure to be here.
Oh, appreciate that. There was one other thing since, it looks like he is having some issues. So I do have one other question here from Paul Davies. And so he was remarking that working, so I've got my own opinion on this, but I'll pose it to you. Working with engineers who I would say insist on working in things like Markdown and RST, the engineers, or perhaps Paul himself, feels that DITA feels a bit old-fashioned. I don't necessarily agree with that, but he's asking, how does DITA stay relevant today, other than being what is driving the market?
Well, DITA, again, if we think of the problems that DITA was set to handle, and some of them, yes, are topic orientation. Yes, you can do that with Markdown.
Yep.
But one of the things that is at the core of DITA is the ability to do reuse by reference or transclusion. And we have very rich architectural functionality for that, based around keys, based around conref. And if you need the ability to do reuse by reference, you're kind of past the confines of what you can do in Notepad and in Markdown.
Yeah.
Now, I know different implementations are, they start augmenting their Markdown with Jekyll, and they add this flavor in or that flavor in. And then you've almost rebuilt your own little custom environment.
Right. Yeah. Where DITA?
That's my take on that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. It's
sorry, I was kicked out, but I'm back.
Hey.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I think those limitations in those other systems they might make it very, very, I don't know, appealing for the short run or for a narrow band of individuals. But as far as being able to manage everything within the organization and being able to publish and be able to accept everything within the organization, those standards are by necessity and by design very lean. And so you can only extend them so far because of the way that they were designed and the intent with, for which the thing that they were intended to fill.
Yeah.